All right. Premise number 2 as to why the environmental review was insufficient was that insufficient environmental analysis of everything, basically. So, remember how I've repeatedly said now in a couple of videos that an AUAR, the environmental review used by the city, is still required by Minnesota law, that it has to be at the level of an environmental impact statement. This is not a lesser form of environmental review. It's not a concept level guide. It's not a brainstorming guide. This is a legit environmental review that has to be on par. If you're using this, you've got to put the same level of analysis into it that you would if you were doing the highest level of environmental review. So, premise of this lawsuit, premise 2, the environmental review is insufficient, is saying you didn't do that. So, there's a few different components of the environmental review. So this is going to be probably maybe a little bit longer. First up, water. Water is a really big issue with data centers, and if you've looked up anything related to data centers, I guarantee you've seen water come up as an issue. So, Pine Island is no exception. Water is still an issue here. So, when it comes to environmental review, remember that it's direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts that need to be studied, and the potential of any of those, potential of cumulative effects, potential of any direct or indirect effects need to be fully analyzed and studied as part of your review. So, the lawsuit gives an example of a mining project from 2015 that engaged in the environmental review process and did a detailed groundwater analysis. So they did modeling to see what are the groundwater flow models, what's the impact of the aquifer. They calibrated any monitoring to wells. They mapped the aquifer drawdown and the sewage or the seepage pathways. They even did a solute transport analysis to predict how metals might be transmitted through through different recharge scenarios. They accounted for storm runoff and climate stress. All of that. That's an EIS, environmental impact statement level of analysis, that should have been done. The city and Ryan companies for Project Skyway did not do any of that. They have a far less detailed analysis of water impacts. They state that Project Skyway could use up to 55.7 million gallons of water per year of the city's water. That brings the total water usage for the city's water permit almost pretty much up to the water appropriation permit limit of the city, almost to the gallon. And that also represents a 50% increase of the entire city's current water demand of 110 million gallons of water per year. But again, there's no groundwater analysis done beyond just stating how many gallons of water the project is supposedly going to use. There's no analysis of aquifer impacts, no analysis of any well interference that could happen. That's kind of a big deal when you live in a rural community surrounded by other rural communities where there's a lot of people here that have private wells. And lawsuit continues to address that lack of detail is continued throughout this entire environmental review. So with water, using 55.7 million gallons a year, they say that 6.8 of that is going to be used for irrigation purposes. But when you go back to those scenario A and scenario B, so remember your mixed scenario, like a technology center / light industrial or full technology center. Remember when I read that in the previous video, neither of those scenarios specified any irrigation needs. But now in water, they're saying 6.8 million gallons of water a year is going to be needed for irrigation. Well, the whole purpose of the environmental review is you have to actually get detailed and specify things like that. So if you know that you're going to need water for irrigation, you also need to include irrigation in your project description. What's the irrigation for? And the other issue with the water is there's a lot of questions about why do you need that much water? Because what they're stating, after this environmental review got passed in September 16th, there was an open house on October 8th. That room, City Hall was packed for that meeting, thanks to me and 4 other moms. At that meeting, representative for Project Skyway stated that all of that water would simply be used for kitchen, bathrooms, and cleanup. So that information, though, is actually not included in the AUAR. But yet here again, they know apparently what that water is going to be used for, but didn't put that into the environmental review. That's questionable. And it also doesn't explain why that seemingly modest use of water is going to consume half as much water as the entire city. We have a population just under 4,000. Valid question. All right, and we continue. Another issue with the water, conservative estimate. One of the pieces of environmental review that was specified in the other video was, you need to do full scope. And what are you building? Minimum, maximum, worst case scenario, potential impacts of everything all together. But they only give one number for water use, and it's conservative. So if it's conservative, that implies that there's a not conservative number that is therefore not included and should have been. All they simply say is that this number was calculated to align with the city's 2045 water demand of 278 million gallons a year. And that it's not going to exceed the city's currently permitted water appropriation volume. That matters because the water numbers that they have given have just maxed out almost to the gallon the current permitted water appropriation volume. But yet, again, now they're basing water usage off of the 2045 water demand and a higher water appropriation permit. So that does make you wonder how much water is actually going to be used by this. So by failing to disclose the source, duration, and use and purpose of the water, the city didn't do its job in fully analyzing the environmental impacts of the project, also violating the public's right to meaningfully engage in the review process. One thing, at the June 15th open house for the PUC, the Public Utility Commission, Alan Gleckner of Google was there, and I directly asked him how much water is going to be needed to fill this supposedly closed loop system that came out again after the environmental review is published. Closed loop is not mentioned anywhere in the AUAR. Important detail to leave out. All it says is air cooling, no water use. That's it. But he says that 1.5 million gallons of water is going to be needed for that initial fill of the tubes of this closed loop system with water. But he also couldn't specify any of the chemicals used. That also matters. All right, energy impacts failed because the AUAR does not disclose how much electricity Project Skyway is going to use at all. There's no mention of megawatt usage. There's no mention of the number of backup diesel generators or this world's largest battery that we found out about through news articles in March of 2026 after all project approvals were done in January of 2026. All of those pieces actually should have been mentioned, not just in the environmental review, but also in that scoping document. Remember premise 1, insufficient scoping? That's there because there are certain pieces, remember, that trigger a mandatory category, meaning you can't do an AUAR. You have to do an environmental impact statement, a different type of environmental review. One of those mandatory categories, power generation. So the fact that they omitted that means that they actually violated the law, and again violated, public commenting rights that we have as residents, because part of doing your due diligence is to be honest about what you're building up front, so you can know if the environmental review that you are doing in the first place is actually what's required by law. So the fact that they didn't include those numbers means that they failed to even do that basic due diligence of assessing whether or not an AUAR was the correct form of environmental review for them to have done in the first place. And there was no analysis of grid impacts by leaving out energy usage, power usage, all of those pieces that are connected to it. That also matters when you know, and you can do any sort of search that says data centers consume massive amounts of electricity. That has an impact on the local grid. It has an impact on the local community. Everything. You can't just leave it out. But even though they left out the energy usage, they somehow were able to estimate potential emissions. That's questionable because, your emissions are generated, they're caused by your power usage. And so if you are leaving out your power consumption, but then suddenly putting in your carbon emissions, there's another step that gets missed when you're not showing your work. How did you come to those numbers of potential carbon emissions and cumulative impacts? You need to do that because Pine Island 52 is right there. That's the only main thoroughfare between Rochester and the cities. There's a lot of car traffic there. Cars produce pollution. You need to do your cumulative impact analysis, remember, of what are the air pollution concerns of not just your project, but how your project on top of the air pollution from all of the traffic going on 52. Air pollution dispersal maps. What's the cumulative impact of all of that? They should have done that. They didn't do any of that. And the carbon emissions that they did generate are equivalent to the greenhouse gases emitted from 8.1 natural gas-fired power plants yearly. So, Pine Island, surrounding area, were you aware that there's the equivalent of 8.1 gas power plants going in up the street from a lot of our homes? It's kind of a big deal. You can't just dismiss that away. Yeah, emergency backup power. That's another thing. It's not just your transmission lines. Again, those diesel generators, noisy. That matters because now you also have to study noise. Generators are noisy and they produce a lot of air pollution. You need to say exactly how many you need. And if you don't say how much energy you're using, you also then don't know how many backup generators that you need. And if you're reading the PUC dockets now, 26170, go read it. All of that information is still classified as trade secret. Interesting. So, noise and light pollution is another category. And as I just hinted at, backup generators cause a lot of noise. And that noise needs to be studied as, along with all the rest of the noise in the community, cumulative impacts. How does backup generator noise combined with noise from Land O'Lakes and the traffic on 52 and any other noise in the environment, on top of, we know that data centers can produce low frequency noise that's described as low-pitched roar topped with a tiny screech by residents in other parts of the country living near data centers. That's specifically highlighted in the lawsuit. But there was no analysis of any of those noises. And we know that that low-frequency noise can be heard day and night. It travels for miles and contributes to sleep disruption, headaches, and decreased quality of life for impacted residents. That is specifically mentioned in the environmental review. This is just premise 2, remember. And the EQB, Environmental Quality Board, specifically says that an AUAR has to include or join major noise sources, but they don't even identify the data center as being a major noise source, yet the city will acknowledge that it can produce between 24 and 70 decibels, A-weighted decibels, low frequency or C-weighted, of operational noise. But there's no details provided in the environmental review as to how they calculated this noise. So again, what are you building? What are all the components of it? How much noise? You're going to follow state law, which says 8 decibels, but we also know that there's a piece missing, and you still need to look at that, show your work, and do an analysis that studies all the direct, and potential direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts of all of that. They didn't do that. Okay, light pollution. We also know that hyperscale data centers, particularly large ones like Pine Island's 3 million square feet, can generate light pollution. Residents living in Virginia next to hyperscale data centers report that the facility's lighting is easily seen for miles, glowing at night like a giant city of lights. The guidance of the Environmental Quality Board, state law, specifically instructs that cities have to analyze any impacts on scenic views and vistas in the AUAR study area, including both direct physical impacts and impacts on visual quality or integrity, and identify appropriate mitigation. So in the AUAR, the city does go as far to simply state that lighting could impact wildlife and neighboring properties. But beyond any generic comments, there's no analysis whatsoever of how a 3 million square foot data center would be lit. So if you don't actually specify how you're doing it, then you also can't provide any sort of analysis on potential direct, indirect, or cumulative impacts of how your project's light pollution is going to add to the existing light pollution, and how all of that could impact, migratory birds, insects, farm animals that surround us, all of that. They didn't do any of that analysis, and that type of analysis is required by Minnesota law. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.